Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Poger. So, obviously the Atari 2600 had a lot of hardware limitations. There wasn't a lot of ROM space to work with. Cartridges usually only carried anywhere from 4 kilobytes up to 8 kilobytes, give or take. So because of this limitation, Atari games usually only had a few levels or a lot of repetition with minimal changes in the gameplay. But there was one ambitious developer that wanted to get the most out of that 4 kilobyte limitation, and we're going to take a look at it. So with that said, leave a like if you enjoy this video, and if you like obscure gaming retro content, drop a subscription. It's a very small thing, but it helps me out greatly. So with that said, let's take a look. So it was the late 70s. A few programmers who worked for Atari were not happy with the way they were being treated. Programmers were not being credited for their games, and Atari didn't offer incentive pay for games that sold well. One programmer in particular, David Crane, brought in $20 million for Atari, but he never received any incentive or recognition for it. Crane and 3 other employees, Larry Kaplan, Alan Miller, and Bob Whitehead, were Atari's best programmers, but they felt they were being mistreated. The 4 programmers tried meeting with the CEO of Atari, Ray Kassar, to discuss demands that they had. They wanted royalties for games they programmed, and they wanted their names printed on the boxes, but the requests were denied. The 4 programmers, fed up with the company, decided they were going to leave and start their own company. However, there is no such thing as a third-party game company. It was commonly agreed that in order to make games, you have to make a console first. No company had ever not done that. But despite all of that, the 4 persevered and created their own company in 1979. They originally agreed on the name Computer Arts Incorporated, but they changed it to Activision shortly after. Activision was already in the front seat because the 4 founders knew the 2600 very well. After all, they were Atari's best programmers. The company did a few things to make their games stand out from ones published by Atari. For one, the boxes were more colorful. They featured screenshots of the game right on the front, so what you see is what you get. Secondly, the games were more visually appealing, more colors on screen. Activision started out with a few games, Dragster, Fishing Derby, Checkers, and Boxing. They started crediting their programmers on the box right away, and even put the Activision logo at the bottom of all their games. They were practicing all the fundamentals that they said they were going to do. So while Activision was still brand new, there was another skilled developer who remained at Atari. Her name was Carol Shaw. So while still at Atari, she helped with several games, including 3D Tic-Tac-Toe, Video Checkers, Super Breakout, and others. While she didn't feel mistreated like the other developers did, she wanted to leave the company because of the stressful environment and downsizing that the company was going through. She didn't originally join Activision because she wasn't told about it. It wasn't until she was employed with another video game company, Tandem, that she was offered a position at Activision. Since she was hired from Tandem, this avoided possible lawsuits with Atari since Activision agreed not to steal employees directly from Atari. So for her first project, she wanted to make a space-related game, but the idea was rejected by Alan Miller because of the large number of space games on the 2600, so she had to go back to the drawing board. Carol wanted to make some kind of shooter that scrolled. Since she was programming for the 2600, she couldn't make a horizontally scrolling game because of the awkward shape of the playfield graphics. Normally, you would think a pixel would be the shape of a cube, but on the 2600, a pixel is more rectangular if you're using playfield graphics, which is not ideal for horizontal scrolling. However, vertical scrolling would look much smoother, so Carol went with that instead. So since she wasn't able to use a black background or spaceships or galactic enemies, she had to improvise. Rather than black, she would make the background blue. She was originally going to make the playfield of each level be a different color, but with some help from other developers, she ended up going with green for every level because it was more realistic. So with a green playfield and blue background, she was going to make the player a boat, but later changed it to a jet because she didn't like the way her sprite looked as a boat. She would add trees and houses to the playfield to make the game look more realistic, but in general, Karol had difficulties making changes to her game because she only had 4 kilobytes of ROM space to work with. Oftentimes, with the limited amount of ROM space that cartridges came with back then, most games didn't feature a lot of levels, or if they did, they repeated themselves with only small changes to the gameplay. Eventually, Karol's game would become River Raid, which would sell over 1 million copies and become one of Activision's best-selling games, so let's give it a try. Alright, here we go. So like with all Activision games, we see the logo at the bottom when you start. So anyway, you're supposed to make it as far as you can while avoiding enemies and stopping for gas. The fact that you can run out of gas is an interesting mechanic because it means you can't play recklessly. You have to be mindful of how much gas you have left. If you shoot a gas tank on accident, it disappears so you can't refuel. I like this mechanic because it adds strategy to the game. You can't just press the fire button and power your way through this game. So after playing this, I can see why Karol Shaw wanted to make each level a different color, and I wish she went through with it. Maybe it wouldn't have looked realistic, but it would have given the game a little more variety. So yeah, the scrolling is really smooth. It almost feels like an NES game. When I play an Atari game, I expect a static screen, not a moving screen with a big level. Speaking of big, this game is actually massive. I expected to complete the level or see repeating blocks, but that never happened. It just seemed to go on forever. For an Atari game, this is weird because I expect no more than 3 or 4 screens. Having a level this big feels more like an NES game, which is a big compliment. Somehow Karol Shaw fit a massive game into 4 kilobytes of ROM space. I actually looked into it, and this game is completely endless. So how did Karol pull this off? Keep in mind of a few things. The levels are not randomly generated. You don't get a different board every time you boot the game. And the final thing is, this game does not repeat after you progress too far. Most Atari games, when you reach a certain point, the levels start repeating, but this one doesn't do that. This game has a map that keeps changing. So how did Karol do this? Well, I have the answer. So in most games, each block on the screen would be individually stored in the game. For a game this massive, obviously this would take up a lot of space. So instead, each portion of the map is assigned its own number. So every time you boot up the game, the algorithm will generate an endless number and will display on screen whatever level map is assigned to that number. It's not randomized either. The game code starts off with a hard-coded starting value, and then the algorithm generates more numbers based off of it. So why would this save up space? From a programming standpoint, it takes up a lot less space in the code to write a sequence of numbers than hundreds of screens worth of blocks and objects. So Karol Shaw found a way to make a big game out of such little space, and what we get is one of the most unique games on the 2600. After a few programmers were unhappy with their treatment at Atari, they formed Activision, the first ever third-party video game company. Activision happened to feature some of Atari's best programmers. This meant the 2600 would be taken in directions it has never been in before. When Karol Shaw was brought on board, her creativity resulted in one of the most unique 2600 games ever made. Hey, thanks so much for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like rating. It only takes a second and it gets my video noticed by more people. Also, if you enjoy my content, drop a subscription. That way you'll be notified when my next video comes out. Plus, it's completely free. Finally, drop a comment if you have any questions, suggestions, or just want to share your gaming experiences. This greatly helps the YouTube algorithm, and I'm usually pretty good at replying back. Anyway, have a good one, guys.